New York City is, without a doubt, the shining star when it comes to urbanism in the US. Its dense, transit-filled, highly walkable urban fabric warrants its unfortunate price tag. It's a place that makes you wonder, if there are more cities like it, would we all just be happier, able to live, work, and play without having to own and operate a motor vehicle, dumping thousands of dollars a year into something meant to take us from point A to point B. New York City is maybe the one city where being car-free is entirely practical. Until recently, the city was going to implement policy actively encouraging a car-free lifestyle while at the same time actively discouraging car ridership. This isn't going to be a video about it, but as of the making of this video, New York State Governor Kathy Hochul indefinitely halted the state's congestion pricing plan, which would have charged vehicles entering Manhattan from 60th Street and down to anywhere from $1 to $15 depending on the type of vehicle you're bringing onto the island. This was in order to reduce vehicle congestion within the city and provide much-needed funding for updates to New York City's metro transit operations. While the congestion relief zone was controversial when first announced, many people living in Manhattan were relieved. Was this eventually going to propel New York City's metro transit network to the levels of the London Underground or the Tokyo Metro? As urbanists, we're well aware of the fact that cities aren't noisy, cars are. Something that was clear in Manhattan, and many other cities for that matter, during 2020 and 2021. Could this have led to a car-free Manhattan? Dreams of a car-free Fifth Avenue, Broadway, and Houston Street were no doubt swirling in the minds of Manhattanites. But sadly, for now, those dreams seem to be put on hold, indefinitely. But this leads us into the topic of discussion for today. On a recent trip to New York City, before the news of the congestion relief zone plan being halted, I took note of just how intrusive the Big Apple's many vehicles were. Cars seem to be so out of place in a city like this, especially where I spent most of my time in the city in neighborhoods like Greenwich Village, East Village, Soho, the Lower East Side, and just most of Lower Manhattan in general. It's the oldest settled part of the city, and its foundations were built for a time before the invention of the automobile. But the biggest observation I made during my time in the city wasn't about cars necessarily. Rather, it was about pedestrians and the current state of the city's pedestrian infrastructure. And it's not as sunshine and rainbows as you may have thought. I was sort of taken aback by just how unwalkable America's supposed most pedestrian-friendly city is. And it really made me stop and think about what it truly means to be a walkable city in the US in the first place, and how New York City seems to be doing everything in its power to make walking through the city as difficult as possible. Of course, New York City isn't filled with highways running through it or anything, just around it. So it's not becoming unwalkable in the sense that the city is prioritizing road construction over pedestrian infrastructure. Walking in New York City is probably the best mode of transportation there is, with biking and the subway close behind. From 14th Street and up, the city is laid out in a near-perfect grid, with wider avenues running vertically up and down the island, and narrower streets running horizontally. Oh, and of course there's Broadway, Central Park, and a couple other small workarounds, but this layout immensely contributes to the city's easy pedestrian wayfinding. Along with the grid layout, there are some strong urban-adjacent thoroughfares for pedestrians to take advantage of as well, such as the Hudson River Greenway. This greenway is separated from traffic and runs through a series of parks and other trails along the Hudson River and the entire west side of Manhattan, offering beautiful views of the water and city skyline throughout. There's also the High Line, an elevated linear park, greenway, and rail trail created on a former New York Central Railroad spur in the west side of Manhattan, which stretches from about 12th Street in the West Village all the way up to 34th Street in Hudson Yards. This elevated pedestrian path is one of the most innovative pedestrian solutions ever to be realized and offers one of the most unique perspectives of the city, its art, and its architecture, as well as functioning as a way to beat the stoplights and impediments down on the street side. It's amazing how much faster you're able to walk through this part of the city as opposed to doing it on the street level. It really makes you think about what a car-free New York City would look and feel like. So just what's wrong with those tried and true sidewalks and walking alongside the streets, ways, and avenues of New York City? Well, New York City isn't an urban oasis. It's an urban jungle. And if pedestrians are the chimpanzees trying to just swing from vine to vine, well, then these are the lions, crocodiles, and tigers impeding their efforts. Walking through the urban jungle of New York City has now become a mission of sorts. A mission to try and dodge all of these impediments put in our way that really have no business being in the way of people just trying to walk from place to place. Here's a breakdown of the 5 impediments making New York City unwalkable. Impediment number 1 is what I like to call the bullshit vendors. Now, the bullshit vendors are people who decide to make public sidewalks their own private estates, setting up massive tables spread out with all kinds of bullshit It could be cheap jewelry, hats, t-shirts, sunglasses, bootleg CDs, plastic street signs, pins, hats, mass-produced art prints, junk, and even more bullshit junk. Now, keep in mind, most of this activity is illegal street vending, and it honestly blows my mind how many cops there are in the city that just decide to turn a blind eye to this, and they're acting on leadership that totally neglects to realize how detrimental this activity is to pedestrians. These things take up massive amounts of sidewalk, not to mention the dunces who decide to stop and inquire about the bullshit, further clogging up the sidewalks. These things are ugly, chaotic, frequent, and plentiful. It's a bad look for the city and bad for pedestrians. But this is just impediment number one, and while most of it is done illegally without permits, let's talk about impediment number two, the legal way New York City cheapens its urban experience and frustrates pedestrians. It's the infamous food cart vendors. I won't dwell on this impediment too much. They've been in the city for forever. People still decide to eat from them despite certain diarrhea. They're a tourist attraction somehow, which I think is kind of sad. I don't know. These food cart vendors pay the city hundreds of thousands of dollars to operate where they do, and I just think that's a net negative for pedestrians and the city at large. They take up a lot of space too, and right on crucial pedestrian intersections, often blocking the view of walk signs, stop signs, and just generally adding to the sidewalk clutter while contributing nothing to the city. There are cheap meals in the city, ones that won't make you sick, and they're found within city blocks, not blocking sidewalks. Impediment number three is another infamous one that I'm surprised the city hasn't turned into a gimmicky museum or tourist attraction yet. It's the never-ending New York City scaffolding. As many New York City pedestrians know, the sheds and scaffolding have gotten to the point of ridiculous hilarity. So much so that there are entire news articles covering the oldest standing among them. As of February 2024, New York City's oldest scaffolding turned 14 years old. This exact pedestrian impediment was set up a year and a half before Occupy Wall Street, over 2 years before Hurricane Sandy, and over 4 years before the Freedom Tower was even opened. Nice job, New York. According to Manhattan Borough President Mark Levine's website, more than 230 scaffoldings across the city have been up for over 5 years. On average, a sidewalk shed stays up for nearly 500 days. This is a problem throughout the entirety of the city too, from Tribeca to the Upper East Side, and especially around Midtown from what I've experienced in recent years. I do understand the safety and necessity that these bring to job sites. Many of Manhattan's buildings are old and in need of updating here and there, but years and years of these still standing around is absurd. And after such a long time, they sort of become the new norm. A sidewalk meant for sunshine and free movement suddenly becomes a place for homeless to set up camp and for even more, yes, even more, illegal street vendors hoping to operate in secrecy. And in neighborhoods and streets with already narrow sidewalk space, it all just makes for an uncomfortable, unpleasant, and sometimes unsafe pedestrian experience. I have rarely even seen men at work where these sheds are set up anyways. What's going on here, New York? Impediment number four, a rather recent addition to making pedestrians really work for their space, are those god-awful outdoor dining additions. Cities like LA and New York have entire websites for this type of urban renewal program, claiming that this new type of post-pandemic outdoor dining is a reimagining of the use of public space. Sure, I might be in the minority of urbanists here when I say this, but these are the worst, and they only work in a very limited amount of circumstances. First, these are primarily a money grab. Let's be honest. They're a money grab for the restaurants to raise dining capacity, and they're a money grab for the city who charges restaurants extra for using their public space. And pedestrians and patrons both get the short end of the stick here. For one, along with all the other impediments I've already mentioned, and I still have more, pedestrians now have to fight waiters, waitresses, hosts, and bussers while they're just trying to walk on the sidewalk. This is also a huge problem in Los Angeles, where the city has explicitly proclaimed that these dine-out concoctions give restaurants the, quote, opportunity to expand dining seating into public sidewalks, metered or unmetered parking spaces, and alleys. I mean, they're saying it right there on the top of the first page. Restaurants are now allowed to invade public sidewalks, as long as they pay that sweet, sweet fee to the city. And depending on which road the restaurant has decided to hang you out to dry on as a patron, the dining experience likely sucks too. These enclaves are placed on active streets and sidewalks filled with honking cars, revving engines, and all sorts of noise that promise to make the American dining experience more annoying than it already is. This is so obviously trying to replicate the cafe culture of European cities, but America just isn't built for it. New York City isn't Milan, and Los Angeles isn't Amsterdam. Outdoor dining tends to work best in Europe because of its plentiful, large urban plazas, car-free spaces, and just general deprioritizing of large, noisy vehicles. European streets are quieter and way more pleasant to just exist in, and as long as cities like New York allow vehicles on roads not meant for them, this type of outdoor dining will continue to be highly impractical. Keep the food inside the restaurant, except for a very limited number of circumstances where tables, chairs, and waitstaff are separate from the flow of pedestrian traffic. And as for impediment number 5, we're just going to call this one miscellaneous nonsense. Starting with New York City's awful, cracked, and broken sidewalks, you just better hope you don't fall through one and end up riding the top of a subway car beneath you. And of course, you're always going to have people riding bikes and electric scooters at 30 miles an hour on a busy sidewalk for some reason, probably mental deterioration, but that's just my best guess. Also somewhat unique to New York City are those basement grates that take up half of a Brooklyn sidewalk. Half the time they're unlocked or wide open, just waiting for someone to fall right down. Okay. Right now, being a pedestrian in New York City is sort of a hot mess, but it doesn't have to be. So what's the solution here? Well, for one, fix the sidewalks, guys. I don't know what it is about the Big Apple, and even worse, Los Angeles. Some of the highest tax rates in the country, and some of the worst roads and sidewalks in the nation. They get a lot of use, so they should get a lot of care. Figure it out. Next, and I can't believe I have to say this, enforce your laws. Get the illegal street vendors off the sidewalks, and as for the legal ones, can we at least cut down on these? Maybe give out 1 permit for every 2 that expire. It's gotten out of hand, and again, is needlessly taking up already limited sidewalk space. Another thing I can't believe I have to say, finish your projects? Scaffolding old enough to be in high school is a problem. You can do better. And finally, get rid of those dine-out booths, keep tables and chairs inside the restaurant in most cases, and off our sidewalks. And here's a bonus tip for the leaders of the city of New York, no doubt watching this video. Permanently close a few streets to car traffic. The only cars that should be allowed in Manhattan are delivery vehicles, ambulances, fire trucks, and police cars. But until that's realized, the city could do with closing off some pedestrian-heavy streets and districts in the meantime. For example, the entirety of Williamsburg should be car-free, as well as most of Lower Manhattan. Soho should be entirely car-free, and I know I'm not the only one saying that either. So many pedestrians being forced onto such small sidewalks is bordering on inhumane at this point. I'm never going to blame the pedestrian. Urbanism and urban environments encourage pedestrians to explore. But man, the best walks I had in New York City were on closed streets or greenways. It's so much more enjoyable than dodging the dozens of pedestrian impediments per minute. New York City, it's time to get your priorities straight. And if you want to get your priorities straight and you enjoyed this video, then drop a like and subscribe. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers as of the making of this video, and we're real close. I've got a bunch more ideas for the channel and enjoy seeing it and the community grow. So come claim your free I was here before the channel blew up pass. I'll see you next week from 4th place.